Hello, everybody, and thanks for joining our Culture Connection series on Edgar Allan Poe, a writer we all know, but maybe not very well, a writer we've all read, but maybe just The Raven. His works are probably scarier and gorier than you remember. His love poems are deep and touching. His life was dramatic. He lived during an equally dramatic period in American history and culture, and that's what we're here to talk about today. I'm Michael Beckelheimer, coming to you from Washington, D.C. This program is presented by the American Center in Moscow, which is supported by the U.S. Embassy in Moscow. And if you're watching on the American Center's YouTube channel or VK or Telegram, please post comments, questions at any time. We'll be reviewing them. Tell us which stories and poems by Edgar Allan Poe you love or don't love or want to know more about. So we're here to answer questions and just have a good time talking about everyone's favorite writer. So today we're going to begin our exploration of Poe in this four-part series at the most obvious starting point, Poe's tales of horror, which we're all familiar with. But we're going to look at his horror tales through another fascinating lens, his life story, and in particular, his relationships with women in life and in his writing. And our guest today is an expert on all of this, Dr. Amy Brannon Armiento. She's a professor in the English department at Frostburg State University in Maryland. She specializes in 19th century literature of the US and Great Britain and teaches courses on Romanticism, women in literature, and literary theory. She's renowned as one of the country's top experts on Edgar Allan Poe, and she's on the executive committee, past president, of the Poe Studies Association. And she's a board member of Poe Baltimore, which is a cultural foundation that celebrates Poe. Amy, thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me.
It's wonderful to get to talk to you in person, sort of, about Poe. But let's start where we always start with our guests and find out how you got to Poe. And I understand that Lord Byron and Stephen King may have been involved in that. So tell us about your path to Poe.
For sure. Unlike many of my colleagues who study Poe, I didn't start with Poe. As you mentioned, I fell in love with Lord Byron when I was in high school, particularly his dark poetry, like Childe Harold's Pilgrimage. I don't think this will come as a surprise to many, but in high school, I was a little angsty. I think many high school students feel like they don't fit in and they are maybe have a little anxiety about that. And something about the verses I read by Lord Byron fit into that kind of moment in my life. And he's sort of the original bad boy of poetry, and Edgar Allan Poe will cultivate that image a bit himself. The French term is poète maudit for that sense of this tortured genius who writes poetry. So you have Lord Byron sort of originating that idea, and I'm not going to shy away from admitting I was attracted to that image. And so I was reading Lord Byron, but also at the time when I was growing up in the 80s into the 90s, Stephen King was quite popular. And so I was reading many of his stories, his novels, and then they were being adapted for film. And I was watching those works as well. And I was reading a lot of Anne Rice. She's probably most famous for Interview with a Vampire. And I was reading some other older writers like Thomas Hardy, and many of these writers kept referencing explicitly Edgar Allan Poe, and I had encountered him, but I wasn't drawn to him. But I kept finding these turns to Poe, and I thought, well, maybe I need to go back and read a little bit more Poe. And I recall reading The Telltale Heart again in high school, and that story just really gripped my imagination, and even controlled my heart rate a bit, the way it's crafted. And I had a visceral response to the story. And then I was hooked. I was like, okay, let's do Edgar Allan Poe when I went into school.
You're hooked. Let me ask you, you went back to read him. One of the things that I've noticed is we all seem to know Poe, but I don't know if many people really read a lot of Poe. Would you find that? I mean, is that when you went back to read him, did you realize, wow, there's a lot to be read that we don't really get?
Right. So, and in the United States, it's likely that you will encounter him for the first time in junior high or middle school. So our sixth, seventh, eighth grade years. And and I think for most people, they're going to get the Telltale Heart, or perhaps the Cask of Amontillado, or maybe the Pit and the Pendulum. But it seems to be the Telltale Heart. And then in high school, they're probably going to encounter The Raven or Annabel Lee, perhaps The Fall of the House of Usher. So those are definitely works that we associate with him. Of course, these are the scary stories, the horror tales, the dark poems, but he's written many works. In his lifetime, he was known for his literary criticism primarily, so he has quite a stack of reviews, usually telling the readers of the day what is wrong with his fellow writers. He was not the most endearing critic. And then he was writing poetry, but he started to write more stories because he needed to make a living, and the stories sold better than the poetry. And for most of his life until 1845, when he publishes The Raven. And then at that point in 1845, he has only 4 more years before he dies. So he doesn't get to relish that fame for very long as a poet. So yes, there are seafaring stories, like your background there, The Descent into the Maelstrom. Those are very popular in his day, as well as the detective story that many people think of Poe as the father of the detective story.
Well, so let's talk about the scary stories. He
Yeah.
wasn't the first to write horror. He was influenced. I wanted to ask you about the influences on him, and what was the appetite for scary stories and horror tales? Because I know um, there were there were criticisms that perhaps he was too violent or too extreme. And we'll talk about Barry Nicey later, I'm sure. But just that, the experience of reading that story in a magazine, shocked people. What did people want out of their horror tales at that time?
So, so I'm going to talk about the influence leading up to how we get to Poe and then what people are expecting. So, Poe is writing in the 1830s and 40s primarily when we think about these stories that are famous today. But in the late 1700s, we get the Gothic tradition, and that's coming out of England. For the English Gothic tradition is going to influence Poe, but before England, it's actually in Germany. Poe's famous for saying that terror is not of Germany, but of the soul. So he's getting like layers of national traditions, if you will, by the time he's writing his horror stories. And I think many of us may be familiar with the Grimm fairy tales, for example. So the fairy tales are starting to fuel the Gothic tradition, but then we get this sort of flourishing of novels coming out of England in the 1700s. We have Walpole's The Castle of Otranto. We have Lewis's The Monk. We have Radcliffe writing The Italian and The Mysteries of Udolpho. All of these books are sensational. They feature all the things we expect from a Poe horror story. So there could be a haunted house. Often for them, it's haunted castles. There are threats within that castle, usually from family members. We might have dungeons. We have storms, the dark and stormy night trope that we're used to. All of that is coming out of this Gothic tradition. And Lord Byron is writing in the Gothic tradition as well. So you get these dark heroes. You get the threats against women in particular in these plots. So you can see how someone like me who's interested in the women in Poe stories can see that happening later when, or see that through line, I should say. One of Poe's first stories he ever wrote, it's the first story in print, is called Metzingerstein. and its subtitle is A Tale in the Imitation of the German. So he is very upfront about this influence on him, and the appetite for these stories is huge. And there is a magazine out of Britain called Blackwoods magazine, and it is known for these sensational stories, and so often has graphic violence, beheadings, stabbings, strangulation. They would call them sensational stories because it really grabbed the senses. And so when I read The Telltale Heart and I had that visceral reaction to the plot, that's exactly what the sensational story is trying to do, get you engaged in that kind of way. So people were very hungry for these stories, and Poe stumbled upon this market success formula early on in his career and was able to exploit it.
So we know that he was probably one of the first writers, American writers, who lived off of his writing, right? He had to make a living from the writing.
He lived very poorly off of his writing. He was
Poorly,
often
sure.
yeah, he attempted to do it. Yes, sorry to
Yeah,
interrupt. Go ahead.
yeah, no. Yes, poorly. Well, I mean, I think a lot of writers live poorly even
Mhm.
today.
For sure.
Um, but he was publishing. There was an appetite for this, but of course, there's something about Poe that makes him a natural for this genre, and we should talk about that. What is it about Poe's life and his experience and his attitudes that drew him to these tales of horror?
So I think I should say this disclaimer. So those of us who study literature, we hesitate to bring the life of the writer into their works. Now, having said that, of course, his life is influencing his works. So I think for many readers, when they start to learn about Poe's life, they can understand that he would be drawn to some of the darker sides of life right at the beginning when they see that he lost his mother and father at a very young age. So those events are incredibly important to setting up the trajectory of his life and then the kinds of stories he might want to tell, and why we can understand there would be this distrust of other human beings, and this fear of other human beings. And even in some of his stories, this duplicity in the characters, where it seems like someone might be doing you a kindness or they may be your friend, only to then be the person who wants to kill you, right? So, and there I'm thinking of something like the Cask of Amontillado or the Telltale Heart. The victims don't really have any inkling that they're about to be targeted by their murderers. So, so when Poe is just shy of 3 years old, his mother, Eliza Poe, dies from tuberculosis. She was a traveling actress and very famous in her day, and she happened to be on the road in Richmond when she passed away. And Poe had an older brother and a younger sister. So there were 3 children. Now, we are unsure what has happened to his father at the time of his mother's death. We just know that David, his father, is no longer with the family, and shortly thereafter, we believe he's died. So he's just sort of disappearing, and there's speculation that the marriage had some issues because Eliza was a famous actress. But David, although he tried to be an actor, he was not very good at it at all. The reviews of him are pretty poor. And so there might have been some tension in the marriage because of the different levels of success in that career, but that is pure speculation. So unfortunately, when his mother dies, the children have to be split up. So his older brother, William Henry Leonard, he goes by Henry, he goes to Baltimore where the Poe family, so Edgar's grandparents are living, and some aunts and uncles are up in that area. His oldest brother goes to the family, the natural family up there. But Edgar and his sister Rosalie, they're still in Richmond. And so 2 Richmond families step up and decide to become foster parents. So many people on here probably know, the Allens will be the family who takes in Edgar Allan Poe. That middle name Allan that you hear when we say Poe's full name, that is his baptismal name. He was christened with the name Allan. So it's important to note, because it impacts his life, that his foster parents never adopt him officially. So even though he carries the Allan name, he was not adopted by his parents. So I could go on, and maybe people will have questions about his early life, but he's going to experience trauma after trauma. He's going to eventually have issues with his foster father. They argue all of the time as he gets older. One of the arguments they have is about Poe's love of Lord Byron. So, that endears me to him even more. Lord Byron was considered to be a bad influence. People who were good people didn't read him. He was dubbed a member of the Satanic School because of the way he would present material, immoral material, as if that was something to strive for, many people believed. So that pull that Poe had to Byron was really problematic for John Allan. And so shortly into his young adulthood, his foster mother, who he did have a strong connection with, Frances Allan, she dies of tuberculosis. So here we are, another woman in his life dying of tuberculosis. He's a little bit at sea. Eventually, he will connect with his aunt and cousin, and that cousin's name is Virginia. She's quite young. After a couple of years, they decide to get married. She's 13 at the time that they get married. There's so much we could talk about there, but I'm going to just kind of skip through to by most accounts that are extant, they had a very loving marriage. It was he doted on her, and then she dies of tuberculosis. So that happens in 1847. And then in the final 2 years of his life, he has, of course, had the fame of the Raven in 1845. He's in New York City, and he starts to become entangled in some scandalous relationships with women writers. And near the end of his life, he reconnects with a childhood sweetheart, a romance that was thwarted early in his life. Her name's Elmira Shelton. And then there's a mystery basically about what happens to him, because he's found dead in Baltimore. So it's just blow after blow as far as romance, mother figures, father figures. And so he's certainly drawn to the dark side of life.
And I appreciate your point that the life of the writer does not dictate the writing, but there is this myth, and there's sort of this idea that Poe had this tortured life, because everything you said, plus the alcohol,
Yes.
the poverty, the moving from place to place, just a million problems. But I think there's also evidence that he wasn't a miserable person all the time. He was happy, he had friends, he was social. So there are a lot of qualities about Poe that we don't normally hear. So, and I'm hoping over this series to look at those different aspects of Poe. But since today we are talking about, his scary stories and all of the darkness, I thought I would ask you about some of those dark aspects of his life. What were you've mentioned the Telltale Heart, which I know you love, and the Cask of Amontillado. Can you tell us a bit about those two stories? I mean, they're classic tales. Tell us a little bit about what they are, what they mean to you.
Okay, sure. So we'll start with the Telltale Heart, which, as you mentioned, is my favorite. And I guess a little bit ironic, since I specialize in Poe and women, and there are no women in that story. So the setup of the Telltale Heart is basically you have an old man in this house, and then the narrator of the story is someone who's lodging with the old man, and everything seems to be fine. They seem to get along. The old man is rich. There's a mention of his gold in the story, because our narrator says that this is not a motive for killing the old man. And sometimes that is read as that's exactly the motive for killing the old man. And when Poe has these lovely moments in his stories where he's saying, it's not this, and then you think, I'm pretty sure it might be that. So you have these little moments, and that's a great example. So these two guys are living together, and like I said, everything appears to be fine, but what ends up happening is that the narrator becomes obsessed with the old man's eye. So he has a film over one of his eyes, what we might call a cataract today. And the narrator just becomes more and more horrified by this eye, and he calls it the vulture eye, and he's decided he has to get rid of this eye, and the best way to do that would be to murder the old man. And he does this quite methodically. So what he wants to do is essentially kill the old man in his sleep. So for 8 nights, he will walk to the old man's bedroom door, slowly open it a crack, and with his lantern, he will slowly open the lantern until the ray of light shines on the old man sleeping. And it is not until the 8th night that the old man wakes up and the light happens to catch the vulture eye. And all the previous nights when the old man's sleeping and the narrator does not see that vulture eye, he cannot bring himself to commit the murder. But once he's able to see that eye, it's the impetus for the violent act, as he tells us. Again, this narrator is trying to convince us he is not insane. He actually has a whole beginning of the story where he's like, I am actually quite sane. And again, we're thinking, are you? And of course, he does end up killing the old man. And then what he does is he dismembers him and he hides his body parts under the floorboards. So during the murder, the old man screamed and the neighbors heard. And so the police come, and many people are familiar. Even if you haven't read this story, you may have seen this trope in other stories. The narrator who has killed the old man is haunted by the sound of a beating heart. And he's convinced that the police officers can hear this heartbeat under the floorboards, and they're just toying with him when they're searching the house. And eventually he gives himself away. He cannot take that beating of the heart. So yeah, the telltale heart. Many people, not all, but if we want to bring in Poe's life, some people interpret this story as Poe in the role of the narrator and John Allan as the old man. And so it's a wish fulfillment to get revenge on the foster father. John Allan eventually became quite a rich man in Richmond, and so there are some fun parallels there if we want to make something of it.
You mentioned revenge, and then the Cask of Amontillado. That is also considered another example of potentially Poe exacting revenge on a rival, right?
Yes.
Maybe
Yes,
maybe
for
that's your
sure.
specialty. It's revenge.
Yeah, for sure. So, and the reason I like the Cask of Amontillado so much is that it's so funny. So if you like dark humor, there are so many little puns, and once you know how the story ends, there are jokes in there that foreshadow the ending. And that's pretty true of most horror writers, that they have a sense of humor. It's sort of kind of this funny thing that I think they just, Stephen King's the same way. It's like if you're in the darkness so much, you're able to appreciate the humor of life and the ironies of life, right? So the Cask of Amontillado, I think, is very rewarding for the humor. But you're exactly right. It's another revenge story. It takes place during Carnival. So here we are. We just had, if you observe Lent, we just went through Mardi Gras right before Lent began. So it's a timely story, and basically you have, again, 2 male characters, and you have Fortunato. That's an ironic name. He's going to be the victim. And then Montresor, and Montresor believes that Fortunato has insulted him in some way, and it is unclear what the insult actually is, so there's room for speculation there. And and he basically tricks Fortunato into going down into the catacombs by baiting him with the idea that he has this hard to come by liquor called the Amontillado, right? And that Fortunato fancies himself a connoisseur of fine liquors, fine wines, and so he's baited down into the catacombs where he will be walled up and left to die. And he's also confused about why he's being walled up. It just seems to have no idea what the offense was. And so this story, again, can be read as Poe in the role of Montresor, the killer, exacting revenge on a father figure like John Allan. But I think more people, if they're going to bring in the biography, they see Fortunato standing in for the literary critics of the day, and that this is Poe exacting revenge for all of the negative reviews and the difficulties he's had in the literary community as he's trying to become famous.
I can tell you're a Poe scholar because you so casually say he was walled up and left to die. I mean,
Yes.
it was a very dramatic scene where brick by brick, and Fortunato is like, "What are you doing?" And then he dies behind this wall.
Yeah, it's very sadistic. Yeah, the way the scene is described, as you said, the brick by brick and the repartee and the mockery that you hear in the story. Yes, it's quite horrible, actually.
Horrible. It's awful. I have to say, preparing for this, going back and reading as an adult a lot of these stories, I was shocked at how gruesome and just disturbing they are, which I love. But on that, maybe that's a sad reflection.
It's a select audience, we might say. Yes.
I have angst too.
Yes.
What is it about Poe that makes this literature? Because these aren't just stories. They're not, scary stories. It's literature. And he reaches back into, just a wonderfully deep well of knowledge about world history, world literature. He brings in all of these references. You need to read Poe with footnotes so you understand what all these connections are. It's beautifully written. So can you talk a little bit about that? Because isn't that an unusual pairing? Like really beautifully written, elegant literary style with this dramatically violent horror.
Yeah, so I think one of the things that makes Poe so satisfying to study is that he is, in my mind, this perfect nexus of bringing together this desire to craft something that is really quite fine in quality. We might say, like, we could critically acclaimed kind of thing, right? Speaking to the critics. But on the other hand, trying to meet the demands of a popular audience, right? So having a writer that can do that, it is very difficult. And so it didn't surprise me looking back that I would go to someone like a Stephen King and then have no problem going back to Poe and saying, okay, before Stephen King, there's Poe, right? And I have Stephen King is very explicit about Poe's influence on him. And one of the quotes that Stephen King has that I love is he said about Poe, Poe followed the lure of the night and nightmares, and the rest of us have been following him ever since. And so that's very nice to hear because there's this tension with other writers like Mark Twain. Mark Twain did not like Poe. He said, to me, Poe's prose is unreadable. And T.S. Eliot, the very famous modernist, he's an American writer and also claimed by the English because he changed citizenships. He said that Poe had a powerful intellect, said that's undeniable, but it seems to me the intellect of a highly gifted person before puberty. And so we just have a myriad of disagreement about how great his literature is, right? But he was very at the same time that he is trying to churn out very quickly lots of works, and that is part of the industry he was in. He was an editor for many periodicals, and he had to fill the pages. That's just how it worked. So while he's being quite prolific, he's also honing his technique. He's thinking about what makes a great story, and he articulates his philosophy of composition in an essay by that name when he's talking about the Raven. But we can see some of what he's talking about for how poetry could be successful also happening in his short stories. And particularly, he had this idea of something called the unity of effect, that everything in the work had to be taking you toward the ending, and that he often knew the ending and then worked the story backwards. And he especially talked about that technique with his detective stories. He was sort of surprised in some of his writings about how people were so taken with this ability to write a detective story, because he was sort of like, well, I know the ending, so I just go backwards to get us to the ending. It's not that hard. Of course it's difficult, and we know this, but for him it wasn't. And he had this idea of crafting a story, making sure that every detail in the story had its function. Usually it was to set the mood or that atmosphere if it's a Gothic work, but also we can see a lot of foreshadowing, such as I mentioned in the Cask of Amontillado. So you are rewarded as a reader with the details. Then, as you mentioned, he has many allusions to other works. And so for the readers of his day, many of them would be familiar with those allusions. Readers today, not so much. So that's why we have to have the glosses. But if you know what those allusions are, then you get little hints at what might be coming in his story, right? So it is pretty fun, and it just also is allowing him to show off his incredible knowledge. And he had excellent schooling, even though he didn't have a lot of money in his adult life. When he was being fostered by the Allens, they were able to send him to some excellent schools.
And he considered himself a genius, right? Like he
Oh,
knew
yes.
he was gifted and he wanted to sort of prove that as he wrote.
Yeah, for sure. He thought of himself as smarter than most people. Yes, for sure. That came through in some of his interactions, and did not always result in friendships then. Yes. Yeah.
Um, how so? Let's talk about women, because I know that's, as you've mentioned, that is one of your specialties. What was it like? So we'll talk about how Poe relates to women or depicts women in his stories. What was it like for you as a young, angsty teenager who grew up to become this scholar of Poe? How was it? What was it like for you to sort of dive into that relationship Poe had with women, the way he depicts women, that whole issue? What is that? What was that like for you?
I think issue is the exact correct word. It is fraught for sure. Um, so there's always in my mind two ways for me to approach Poe: as the casual reader who just wants to enjoy him, and then I have to put on my scholarly hat and be like, now I must analyze what's going on here. I love reading the poetry that features women such as The Raven, Annabel Lee. Ullalum is one of my favorites. That one's not read nearly as much as the other two. Um, and then the stories that feature women. He has a whole series of women tales. So you have Ligeia, Berenice, Morella. We include The Fall of the House of Usher in there with Madeline. So and there are more. So it's kind of this interesting world that he has created that is problematic if you are a woman reader. So he is notorious for saying that the most beautiful, most poetical topic in the world is the death of a beautiful woman. So as a woman, it's like, okay, what do I think about this writer where he's decided from the get-go he's going to start with dead women, or we're going to have dying women in the stories. That's a little bit problematic. There is power in some ways, of course, for the beautiful woman who has captured the heart of the speaker of the poem, and you see how much he appreciates her. But as a woman reader, it's sort of like, well, is it because she's dead and he's seeing her with eyes that he might not have had if she was still living? So, and then I can turn to the stories and find my answer there, perhaps, because those women are living and often they are being persecuted and tormented by their husbands or lovers. So it is definitely a difficult world to be in, I think, when you're trying to decide if you want to defend Poe or if you want to say, well, we have a problem here, sir. Um, so, but in the end, his women are memorable. They are powerful, even if they don't get to survive. Some of them get to come back and exact their revenge, which I appreciate. If you're mistreated, you get to at least have some sort of response to that, and take down the person who has persecuted you or tormented you. So I enjoy that element. I also know now that he's writing within this Gothic tradition where he hasn't invented this formula where the women are going to be victims. And so it's kind of nice to see how he allows them to have some power that other writers don't. So it is definitely difficult. I would not by any means consider him a feminist. So, yeah.
Was this a topic at the time in discussions with Poe or criticism of Poe? I know that you've done research on women, female scholars of Poe over the years. And actually, I remember hearing you say once that you were surprised that they didn't seem to take issue with this, or maybe didn't grapple or deal with this issue very much. What was the attitude before you on how Poe treated women?
I think so. I think that women, even in his own day, saw some things that were going on there with women that they were a little uncertain about. In Poe studies, there has been, this is my impression over the years, there has been moves to insulate Poe from some criticisms because it could potentially impact who might read him. So there's been some defenses about maybe he's not misogynistic or anti-feminist. And there are some good arguments for that. He's got so many writings that it is hard to try to figure out his personal opinions about women. Or I know you'll have people on later that will address racism in his works and how he talks about people of color. It's very I was going to say the word dangerous. It is for a scholar. It's dangerous to try to understand a writer's own views based on their imaginary works. So it can be difficult pinning that down. And although we have letters from him, he's not so clear about his stances on some of these social issues with equality and rights for women or people of color. So there is this gap that scholars will argue about. So, but there were people like Margaret Fuller. She's a famous feminist in the US. The way she wants to see couples portrayed, Poe is not doing that. There's no equality, no sense of partnership in his works. So you even would have that kind of pushback in his day. But for the poems with the dead women in The Raven, in Annabel Lee, in Ulalume, that is part of the sentimental tradition. So women writers were writing similar kinds of poetry where we have these dead women and you have the bereaved lovers who are lamenting their loss. That was very much part of the day. And it was thought to be sort of a tribute to these women who were moral and beautiful, often taken way too young in the prime of life. And it provided an outlet, not just for the writers to have a way to find consolation with people who have died young, but also for the readers who would have had the same experiences to relate to that. Yeah.
You may have just answered the question that just came in.
Oh,
Why do you think readers often find beauty and romance in stories that are also deeply unsettling? Is
right.
it because they can
Yeah.
relate to it? How do they relate to these stories?
So, at the time that Poe is writing in the 1830s and 1840s, tuberculosis is just ravaging the United States and many other countries because we're in the midst of the Industrial Revolution here. So, tuberculosis is really able to get a hold on the populations in the places where he lives because he grew up in Richmond, but then he moves to Baltimore. So you have many more people in Baltimore. And then he's just going to follow the work because you mentioned earlier he moves quite a bit. So he's moving from editorship to editorship. So he's in Baltimore for a while. Then he goes to Richmond again to edit the Southern Literary Messenger. He has some issues with alcohol and the workload and the proprietor there. So that doesn't work out. So eventually he's going to go to Philadelphia, where he spends most of his adult life doing editing in the city of Philadelphia. And Philadelphia, in addition to dealing with tuberculosis, they have yellow fever, they have cholera. There are just so many diseases running through these cities. And then he will eventually get to New York. So the fact that we have so many people dying from disease, this is just par for the course for his day. And so the beauty and the romance that is embedded in these, I like this phrasing, deeply unsettling stories that we have by Poe, it ties into this very horrible situation with tuberculosis, in my opinion, very horrible, that not only was someone dying of this disease, often slowly, and experiencing bouts of what seemed to be recovery, only to then find themselves back in the throes of the disease. Tuberculosis had this way of making its victims, particularly women, but also men, appear quite beautiful, ethereal beauty almost. It was sometimes referred to as a life and death. And Poe has a story that he had titled Life and Death, and then it later took the title The Oval Portrait. And so his mother, who was Eliza Poe, the actress, she was often described as quite beautiful, but this description had to do with her showing symptoms of tuberculosis: the rosy cheeks, the deep set eyes, the pale skin. And there's a term for it. Carolyn Day coined this term, consumptive chic. So it's this body of the consumptive, the tuberculosis victim, as they're dying, they're losing weight and their features are becoming more prominent, and that is aligned with beauty. And then just the idea of this beautiful person then having to go to the grave so early, and what that is doing to the loved ones around them, as they no longer recognize that person. They're changing, they're transforming. And Poe uses that to talk about monstrosity in his stories often. So I could go into that more, but I guess that gets us
Again,
where we need to be.
again connected to another question. Why does a dead woman have such a mystical significance, and what is the symbolism? That
Yeah,
beauty and death, I never knew about that. That's fascinating.
yeah, it's heartbreaking, right? And Virginia is gonna go through the same process. So he's not around to see his foster mother and the at the end of her life, and we're not positive that she's died from tuberculosis, but it's just his mother dies 18 years later, his foster mother dies 18 years later, Virginia dies, all probably from tuberculosis. So what is happening that Poe does differently in the poems and in the stories, and I think this might tie into the mystical part and the symbolism, is unlike the sentimental tradition, where at the end of the poem there would be this idea that although this person has died, and yes, that is so sad, I can find consolation in the fact that we will be united in heaven one day, right? For this Christian audience, primarily in the 19th century. He pulls back on that idea of reunification in heaven. At the end of The Raven, there our speaker is under a shadow, believes he will not be reunited. At the end of Annabelle Lee, even though the speaker's insisting they will be reunited, your final image is of the speaker lying beside her in her grave, right? So there isn't this turn where Poe seems to be endorsing this Christian idea of it's all going to be okay in the end because we will get to heaven. Instead, it's sort of heretical, I think, when you think about the speaker basically refusing to go that far and believe that that will be the fate. It's sort of the speaker stopping short, almost in a Faustian way, if you will, of just can't get to that faith, right, when you need it. And so there is a lot of concern, I think, in Poe works that this promise of reunification in an afterlife, he just can't get there. He can't get there in his works. And so, and even in his letters, when he talks about Virginia after she's died, you don't really see this move that we expect from many writers of that day to say, it's all going to be okay because we will be together in heaven. And I don't know if that's because he doesn't believe in a heaven, or for his characters doesn't believe in a heaven, or it's just he believes in it, but he doesn't think the characters are worthy to get there, right? So there's a question about that in his works.
And that's what's so sad about the Raven. He
Yeah.
says, will I meet my Lenore again? And the answer is a definitive no. Nevermore.
No. And he knows he's going to get that answer, right? And that's also, it's a dark humor, right? That poem. It's not humorous for our speaker in that situation, but the reader's kind of like, stop asking the question. And you get a similar thing in The Fall of the House of Usher. Stop reading the story, narrator, or Madeline's going to crash through the door. And yeah, so there's that dark humor again.
There was another trend. You brought up tuberculosis and how that was rampant in the cities with other disease. There's another theme in Poe that I love, and a lot of people do: being buried alive, premature burial. And that was one of my earliest favorites, Poe's story of premature burial. But again, you see it in so many of his stories, being buried alive. Yeah. In my research, I've read that it wasn't uncommon for people to be buried alive. Is that true? And
so,
who buried people alive?
So I don't know if I'd say it wasn't uncommon. It wasn't unheard of. Yeah. and even saying that, that's terrifying, right? So it only took one prominent case. and I'm glad you brought up, Michael, the premature burial, because there are cases that you get a catalog of cases there in real life, and this happened here and this happened there, and they found out later when they unearthed the casket that you've got the idea of the nails that have been scraped off as the person suffocating. It's horrible, right? And we have it in The Fall of the House of Usher as well. And then as you mentioned, the Cask of Amontillado, that's a little bit different because Montresor knew that person was alive. But it's all this fear around some of these diseases like tuberculosis, where so if you think about the descriptions of Madeline Usher, for example, that the narrator and Roderick actually, when they put her in the tomb, they remove the cover and they look at her and they're like, wow, you'd think she's alive. Of course she is alive, but they're not thinking she's alive, and they put the cover back on and seal the vault. But it was that mimicry again of tuberculosis, of you weren't sure if the person was actually dead, but they appeared to be dead, and that sometimes the doctors did get it wrong, and they would have there's a whole market created for people to buy. If you had the money, you could buy some kind of safety for your coffin. It might be a bell system. You probably read about that, Michael, and I think it's mentioned in the premature burial as well. These different things, like a horn that would be that could go down to the coffin so someone could yell or something like that. And you can imagine that, not to get too gruesome, I guess we're there. It's kind of
We're there.
gruesome. And when you have these kinds of safety nets in place, people hadn't always thought about decaying bodies. We don't have formaldehyde yet, those kinds of things. So gases would sometimes create movement in the coffin. Someone might think someone's alive, dig them up, and no, they were not alive. So we have these kinds of things happening. But I it it was just, I think, once a few of these examples had come to light, of course people were terrified that this could happen to them. And I would be too. Yeah. Yeah.
I've told
Yeah.
everyone, just give it a few days. Be very, very sure.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
um,
So why you mentioned the premature burial, and I'm always curious, what are the stories or poems people like by Poe? And you said that was one for you. Is it just that haunting image, or what about it?
the shock, yes. I mean, that I was very young when I read that, and just the shock that that could be possible, and then
Mhm.
the additional shock now of realizing it was possible.
Yes.
So,
Yeah.
but yeah, that one. Of course, I love the fall of the House of Usher. I mean, that's a story that we all know, we all hear about.
Mhm.
Um, but I love, to me, that has all of the classic elements of a horror story that I love. The house, the fact that the house is living, the
Yes.
fact that the house is crumbling, that everything around this big old house is dead. Everybody's insane. It's a crazy family history. It's just everything about it is perfect. I love that story.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, you are not the only one. That tends to be these days, a lot of adaptations. Mike Flanagan just did the series. Many people may be familiar with Silvia Moreno Garcia's Mexican Gothic that came out in 2020. It's the haunted house story that Poe does not create. Like I mentioned, that's a Gothic trope with the haunted castle, but he just takes it to the next level. And like you said, it's that living house, the fungus, that kind of
Mhm.
thing. And also exploiting the idea of the house as representation of the mind. So you have a decaying house, you have a decaying family line, or a decaying sanity, right? So that's so fun, and people love to play with that idea. And yeah, so yeah, The Fall of the House of Usher, I'm always surprised when people say that's one of their favorites, because it's a long story for him.
It's a long
Yeah.
story.
So,
And it veers off here and there, but it's a
mhm.
great story. It's funny that you mentioned earlier how Poe had to, as an editor and as a writer, he had to fill those pages,
Yeah.
and I can't help, and the Fall of the House of Usher is a long story, and I
Yeah.
couldn't help when you were talking about that to think about our Russian audience who's used to Dostoevsky and Tolstoy filling pages, and they're like
Yeah.
writing these huge books filling
Yeah.
these serialized publications,
Yeah.
but Poe was really committed to the short story where you could sit
It was.
down, read it in one sitting, have a wonderful or horrific impression or
Mhm.
emotional response, and then I guess move on with your day.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, and
so
that's so important. That was so important to him, what you said, that single sitting. He talks about that in the philosophy of composition, because if you have to put the work down, you interrupt the mood that the writer has created. So he just didn't want that to happen. So he did not tend to do serialization, like Charles Dickens, one of his contemporaries, would get into the serializing. And like you mentioned, some of the Russian writers, he was like, nope, I need it to be in one place and,
mhm.
and have that effect, right?
Why? So someone asked a question: why are Poe's narrators often unnamed? And I would add to that. Um, why? I mean, one of the things I love about Poe is there's always so many questions. Like, is Roderick insane? What is happening in this family? Why is this guy so focused on Berenice's teeth? It's like there's just so many questions all the time, and we don't know who these people are or why they're doing what they do.
Yeah, I think some of that's a great question, and I don't have a definitive answer, but I feel like a bit of a nod to the fairy tale. The same thing with the obsession, the fixation. The word in the day was monomania. That's such a great word. The fixation on something, that vulture eye, the teeth in Berenice, and that's going to lead to the narrator's demise, basically, because they're going to commit this murder, and then eventually, usually they can't take the guilt and they give themselves away in the stories, or they want to be appreciated, so they give themselves away. The Cask of Amontillado is an exception in that that narrator is assumed to be on a deathbed, and it's 50 years after those events take place. But often, like in The Black Cat, you're getting a confession right before a hanging, so they've been caught, right? I think that there's something with when you don't name the narrator and you use the first person, right? So I, me, my, it allows the reader to slide into that narrator's position and viewpoint. And it's an interesting effect, and it does get Poe into trouble in the same way that Lord Byron got into trouble, although Lord Byron wasn't using that technique. But it's asking us to side with the murderer. It's putting us in their perspective. And so you can imagine, as we're in the 1830s and 40s, England is in its Victorian era. And so we are also in this area of people wanting morality and to uplift clear lessons about how people should behave, that Poe would run up against that way of thinking when it came to literature. And so people would condemn his works and say, I think we're a little too sympathetic with these murderers. But it was a really effective device in terms of getting the readership. And he even said early on in his career, to return to Berenice, when he was sending that story to the Southern Literary Messenger, that story was published in the early part of 1835. Later in that year, he would become the assistant editor for that periodical that's located in Richmond. But when he sent in Berenice, the proprietor, Thomas W. White, he was like, I don't know about this story. This story is pretty gruesome, right? And he's like, I don't know if my reader should be reading this. So there was this hesitation about what are we doing here. And Berenice, it's a first person narrator as well. And so basically Poe was like, I agree, these stories are pretty terrible. But he had this big but, if you will. But you know what, Thomas W. White, if you run these stories, you will have readers, because this kind of story is what people want to read. They want these sensational stories. Blackwoods is making a killing, if you will, on readers because they run these kinds of stories. And so he sort of was like, look, you're right. They're not the most positive stories, not the most uplifting, but if you want to make money, you want the readers, I think we should run some of these stories. He's a little bit mercenary. Yes.
That's an ageless American tradition.
Mm-hmm. And yeah, and you need to make money. Sorry, yeah, make the money. And then sadly he doesn't. He's, we think about how famous he is. I've read somewhere he is the most translated US writer in Russia. The Gold Bug, not one of the horror stories, but a detective story, was the first story of Poe's translated into Russian. The Gold Bug was actually very famous during Poe's lifetime until he writes The Raven, and then he has a comment of something like the bird beat the raven, or sorry, the bird beat the bug. Sorry, bird beat the raven doesn't make sense. The bird beat the bug. So yeah, so the Gold Bug has a lot of readership during his lifetime. And
I love
these
that
stories. Yeah,
next week we're going to talk to Scott Peoples, who is in Charleston, South Carolina, where the Gold Bug is set.
Yes, yeah, on Sullivan's Island, just right there. Yeah, and John Gruser, I know you have too, and he's very much into the detective fiction. So the horror stories are something that come a little bit later, after he's dead. He's known for him in his lifetime, but just not so much as we think of him now, right? And I will say, if listeners, viewers, your audience if you've never read Ligeia, that story came out in 1838, and Poe considered that his best story, Ligeia. So
that was going to be my last question.
yeah.
So tell us briefly about Ligeia.
Yeah, so Ligeia is a story about this highly educated woman. Her education is a little suspect. It seems to be the metaphysical kind of education, maybe a little black magic, we might say today. So she's basically obsessed with some forbidden knowledge, and her husband becomes like her acolyte, and they're studying together, and then she succumbs to a mysterious wasting disease, much like tuberculosis, we might say. And she has decided through her studies that she thinks she has found a way to, after her death, not actually die, for her soul to live on in some way, through metempsychosis, jumping to another body, perhaps. And so she dies, and we actually think she's unsuccessful. And our narrator gets remarried, and this poor woman that he remarries, he basically confines her to a chamber, and there's a mystery about what exactly happens, because it's a first person narrator, and he's like, I think I saw some drops go into a drink. Is he doing this? Is it supernatural? We're not quite sure. But what ends up happening is that the lady Ligeia, who had died, is able to be reincarnated into his new wife. and so she comes back from the dead, and the story kind of stops with the narrator being overcome by the reality of her return, and he's not excited about it. He's actually a little freaked out. So but just the way that the story is written. Yes, go ahead.
One would be,
Yes. Yeah, it wasn't like, hey, we did it, you're back. And this is some of what is influencing Edgar Allan Poe. You've got like Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, these resurrections coming and not being what you expect or what you had hoped for. These are stories that he sees in the culture. He likes how the effects work. He's borrowing them. He's putting his own spin on them. And he's just a master at finding details in the newspaper. So he's got lots of little treats if you're living at the time of like, hey, this reminds me of this story in the news, that kind of thing. So yeah, he's just a genius. I guess I can leave it there.
Leave it there. Yeah. There's so much to read. Well, this conversation was exactly what I expected and hoped for. It was so fun. We learned a lot. Thank you so much for joining us and inspiring us all, I'm sure, to read more. And there is a question in here about the philosophy of composition, which we will talk about in a future session with another guest. That's on our agenda. So please, for those of you in the audience, come back. We have 3 more sessions to talk about different aspects of Poe's life and different genres of his writing. So thanks again for joining us, and I will see you again soon. Bye-bye.